Welcome back to DBC Engage, episode number 2. The first episode, we kind of walked into an introduction to Christian apologetics. This episode, we're going to walk into our first argument for the existence of God. Don't let this argument kind of scare you off. Work through it with me, think through it. I'm going to give you some resources as we work through it, and hopefully you can be better equipped to give a defense for the existence of God. So this episode, we're going to look at what's called the cosmological argument for God's existence. Now, I know that kind of sounds scary, the cosmological argument for God's existence, but hopefully it will make sense as we work through it, and you can be, just feeling confident and talking to your friends and family about the existence of God. The Bible begins with this text: in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. John 1:1 also says that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. John 1:1-3. So the Bible speaks of a beginning, that there was a beginning to creation, that God created ex nihilo out of nothing. So matter's not eternal, God's eternal, and He created everything out of nothing. And so this is what the first argument looks at. It looks at the beginning of the universe. It's called the cosmological argument. And so there's several different approaches to the cosmological argument. Maybe you've heard some, maybe this is all new to you, but the one I'm going to focus on is what's called the cosmological argument. And so, like I said, don't let this scare you off. It's straightforward. It's 3 premises. It's a deductive argument, so that if the premises are true, the conclusion follows. And so here, I'm going to give you the premises right quick. Premise number 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise number 2, the universe began to exist. Premise number 3, therefore, the universe has a cause. So whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And this has been made popular in our time, it's actually an old argument, but it's been made popular in our time by Christian philosopher William Lane Craig. And he did his PhD dissertation on this, and he's formed it and kind of made it applicable for us today, that we can kind of use this thing. So Craig says this in his book, On Guard. I would encourage you to get that book, On Guard. He walks through several different arguments for existence of God and the truth of Christianity and stuff in that book. But in On Guard, and I'm going to cover that book, I'm going to use that book a lot for this argument. Craig writes this in that book: the argument is so marvelously simple that it's easy to memorize and share with another person. It's also a logically airtight argument. If the 2 premises are true, then the conclusion necessarily follows. So anybody who wants to deny the conclusion must regard either premise number 1 or premise 2 as false. All right? So if you want to knock this argument down, you got to say that either premise number 1 is false or premise number 2 is false. If they're not false, then the conclusion follows that therefore the universe has a cause. So let's just briefly walk through the different premises. Let's begin with premise number 1, that whatever began to exist has a cause. And so from everyday common experience that things don't just pop into existence out of nothing. Like this laptop that I'm using doesn't just pop into existence without a mind, without people forming this thing and putting it together. This table didn't just pop into existence. So whatever begins to exist has a cause. There's a cause for this iPad. There's a cause for this table. There's a cause for the universe. So James Dew and Paul Gould in their book, Philosophy, A Christian Introduction, they write this: to argue that anything, Twinkies or computers or universes, can pop into existence out of nothing is absurd. It makes no sense. We just know from experience that things don't just pop into existence out of nothing. Thomas Aquinas referred to this as the unmoved mover, or we could say the uncaused cause. So Aquinas can look at the universe even back in his day and see movement in the stars and stuff. And he says, in order for those things to move, there had to be a mover. and it can't regress all the way back into the past, so there had to be an unmoved mover to move it. And so now as we continue to grow in scientific knowledge, we can trace this back and say there had to be an uncaused cause to this universe, because things don't just pop into existence out of nothing. And so you'll get some pushback, expect pushback. There's a famous atheist scientist named Lawrence Krauss. Krauss argues that ultimately these virtual particles can pop into existence out of nothing. But the problem with what Krauss is saying, when he says nothing, he's not referring to what philosophers mean by nothing. He means that they can pop into existence in this quantum vacuum that he refers to. And so a quantum vacuum is something. It's not nothing. And so Craig explains this quantum vacuum as a sea of fluctuating energy governed by physical laws and having a physical structure. He says that to tell a layman that on such theories something comes from nothing is a distortion of those theories. So what Krauss means by nothing is actually something. It's a quantum vacuum. When we say as something can't come from nothing, when we mean nothing, we mean no thing. What Aristotle said, that nothing is that what rocks dream about, right? You have a rock that has no conscience, that can't dream about anything. So that's what we mean by nothing. So things don't come into existence out of nothing. And so you might get some pushback here. Somebody say, okay, that things can't come into existence from nothing, then where did God come from? And so we might sit back for a little bit and think, okay, maybe they got a good point here. But here's what they're messing up. They're messing up premise number one. Premise number one says that whatever began to exist has a cause. So as Christians, what do we say? That God did not begin to exist. He is eternal. And that which is eternal is uncaused and has no need for a cause. And so whatever began to exist has a cause. So we can just say that, from everyday common experience, that things don't pop into existence out of nothing. Think that through. Before you go into the conversation, just think through some different approaches to that. What might people say in response to it? And be ready for an answer. And I don't think you can get a ton of pushback. You might get some pushback on the God thing, but by definition, God is that which is uncaused. He's eternal. He's not come into existence. So whatever began to exist has a cause. Human life has a cause. Cars have a cause. Tables have a cause. All these things, it's just normal everyday experience. So premise number one, pretty straightforward. Premise number two, the universe began to exist. Okay, so in the past there was, scientists believed, that matter is eternal in the past. It's always existed. There's always been a cosmos there. And Craig gives a couple arguments here at this point. He argues from a philosophical point of view and a scientific perspective. So philosophically, he argues that the universe had a beginning. Scientifically, he argues that the universe had a beginning. The philosophical side of it might get a little bit, it might hurt your head for a little bit. It hurts mine very bad. And you can use this one if you want to, or you can just kind of stick to the scientific perspective. And you know what? Different people like different areas of thought. So I'm going to give you both of them. So Craig gives, like I said, two arguments, philosophical and scientific. Number one, he argues that the universe didn't begin, is not eternal because the numbers of infinity just don't really actually exist. And so he argues from two different perspectives. He talks about potential infinity and actual infinity. So like potential infinity, he says that you can you can think that you can continue on counting 1, 2, 3, and there can always be a number added to that number. So potentially, there's a potential infinity. It means in theory, there's an infinite amount of numbers. So that's potential infinity. Actual infinity means, for example, that if the cosmos has eternally existed in the past, then you would have to go through an infinite number of days to get to this point, which could not happen. And so this, like I say, this hurts my head, but he gives this example. There's a German mathematician back in the past named David Hilbert. And so David Hilbert has this idea, this analogy of what's called Hilbert's Hotel. And okay, so in premise two, that what we're trying to cover here is the universe began to exist. So let's kind of keep this thing in perspective of what's going on here. If the universe began to exist, then it's not infinite. And so here's what Craig's going to argue. There's not an infinite in reality. There's not an actual infinite. And so he gives the example of what's called Hilbert's Hotel. And here's what Hilbert says, that think of a hotel with a finite number of rooms, and all those rooms are filled up. And then a new guest comes to check into the hotel, and the manager there says, hey, we're filled up. There's a finite number of rooms here. They're all filled up. And so, okay, that makes sense. But Hilbert says, imagine a hotel with an infinite amount of rooms, and suppose that they're all filled up. So this hotel, there's an infinite number of rooms, they're all filled up. And then a guest comes to check in. And the manager says, no problem, I've got a hotel here with an infinite amount of rooms. I'll just move the person in room 1 to room 2, and 2 to 3, and 3 to 4, and 4 to 5, and on to infinity. And then number 1 is going to be opened up. And we say, okay, that's kind of weird. That doesn't make sense, but it's an infinite amount of rooms, and okay, that we can do that, maybe. Then he says, now suppose that we push this thing just a little bit further, and suppose that an infinite amount of people show up to check into the room, to the hotel. And the manager says, okay, no problem. I'll move the person in room 1 to room 2, the person in 2 to 4, the person in 3 to 6, and I'll move this person in twice the room number, right? And so you've got, if any number times 2 is an even number, then all the odd number of rooms are opened up. So I can check in an infinite amount of people. And so what they're doing here is just showing that it just doesn't really make sense in reality. And then Craig says, what if all the odd rooms checked out, then an infinite amount of people check out, there's still an infinite amount of people there. So he's using this thing, and Craig says that Hilbert's Hotel is absurd. Since nothing hangs on the illustrations involving a hotel, the argument can be generalized to show that the existence of an actual infinite number of things is absurd. And so what he's saying, that the universe cannot be infinitely old. It had to have a beginning. And this he takes this case and he takes it just a little bit further and kind of takes a different argument to it. And he says that if it's the case, then to say that the universe is eternal would mean that it had to exist for an infinite number of days. And Craig argues that you can't cross infinity. He says that no series that is formed by adding one number after another can actually be infinite, for you cannot pass through an infinite number of elements one at a time. This is easy to see in the case of trying to count to infinity. No matter how high you count, there's always an infinity of numbers left to count. So think about it. If someone says that the universe has existed for an infinite number of days, then to get to that point, you would have to count an infinite number of days. So to get all the way down to day zero, you'd have to first count -1, and -2, and -3, and -4, back to infinity. And Craig says before any number could be counted, an infinity of numbers will have to be counted first. You just get driven back and back into the past. Now that kind of stuff makes my head hurt. I went through this study with a group of friends in one of our small group studies, and some people liked it. Some people actually liked this argument. Most of us didn't like the argument. I think it's cool. I think it can be helpful. I think it can be useful. You got to pick your crowd to use it with. So that's the philosophical argument that Craig says, man, you can't even pass infinity. We couldn't get to today if it's infinitely old. Hilbert's Hotel just makes no sense. So that's the philosophical argument. He says there's also a scientific argument that we can use for the cosmological argument. I kind of like the scientific argument. I think it's interesting to me. Craig mentions that he first argues for the expansion of the universe. Satellite images show us that the universe is expanding. And as it is expanding, it's actually increasing in size. In speed, I'm sorry. As it's expanding, it's increasing in speed as it expands the universe. So if that has been taking place for an infinite amount of years, then how are we still able to observe the universe? Technically, it would be so spread out that we wouldn't even be able to observe anything, and there would just be really nothingness there because for an infinite amount of years it's been spreading. Craig quotes three scientists, Arvin Board, Alan Guth, and Alexander Lincoln, and this shows that any universe that has on average been expanding throughout its history cannot be infinite in the past, but must have a past space-time boundary. So it seems the expansion of the universe had to have a beginning. Or if it's been going on forever, we would not be able to observe it right now. So that's the first argument he gives scientifically. He also gives an argument, what's called the second law of thermodynamics. And basically this argument says, for instance, if you have a car and you have a gas tank, if you fill the gas tank up in a closed system, that usable energy, as you're driving your car, runs out and will end up being gone, right? And so the universe is a closed system that has energy, and scientists can see that the usable energy is getting used up. And if it's a closed system like a car's gas tank, then that will, over time, be used up in what scientists refer to as the heat death of the universe. If that's been going on for an infinite amount of years, by now, the universe would already run out of its usable energy. And so that's another argument that William Lane Craig likes to use, the scientific argument. I like those arguments. And what's it doing? It's just helping us to show that premise 2 is true, that the universe had a beginning. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise number 2, the universe began to exist. And so some people might argue and say, how do you know the universe began to exist? You can say, hey, let me just give you just a couple ideas. One, if it's always existed, we can't cross infinity counting, so we'd never really technically arrived here. But if that don't make sense, think about this, that if the universe is expanding like scientists, all believers and non-believers can see through telescopes, then really we wouldn't be able to see anything if it's always been expanding. And 2, usable energy by now had already been used up. If you fill up your car, you don't have unlimited amount of gas to use. So usable energy would have been used up by now. So there had to have been a beginning. So whatever began to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, premise number 3, therefore the universe has a cause. And so the cause, what's up with this cause? Well, this cause, in order to create it, has to be uncaused. This cause, in order to create time, had to be timeless. In order to create space, had to be spaceless. In order to create material, had to be immaterial. And you had to be extremely powerful. So it had to be a timeless, spaceless, uncaused first mover who is the God of Scriptures. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This creator had to be outside the universe and able to create the universe. So we open up our Bibles, Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And so that's the first argument that I want to give you. I only scratched the surface of this thing. There's tons of books out there. William Lane Craig has some videos online, some animated videos that's kind of helpful and that's kind of short, that kind of explains this thing better. I'd encourage you to pick up the book On Guard. It gives an introductory look to the cosmological argument and several other arguments. It kind of walks into it. There's several other books and videos online that can just help you better understand this argument. So whatever began to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Who's that cause? We argue that it's the God of Scriptures. And so as we work through these different arguments, one argument might not be sufficient for your friends, but as we give the cosmological argument and then the fine-tuning argument and then the moral argument and the argument for the resurrection, we can start building a case to show the unbeliever, you know what, this thing called Christianity is actually reasonable. It makes sense. William Lane Craig writes this at the end of that chapter on the cosmological argument. He says that when I finished my doctoral dissertation on the cosmological argument at the University of Birmingham, Professor Hick took it privately to one of the physicists on campus to have him check the scientific information. The physicist later reported back to Hick that everything I said was correct. When Professor Hick returned the dissertation to me, he looked at me quizzically and said, "Why don't the theologians know about this?" So I think the cosmological argument is a fantastic argument to kind of get the discussion rolling and help it make sense. I hope you enjoyed it. Go back and listen to this episode. Feel free to ask questions. I run to a lot of people at church that's enjoying the podcast so far, and they're asking questions. Feel free to ask questions. Look at videos online. Pick up some material on these different arguments, and be equipped to give a defense for the hope that lies within you, that Peter says. But always do it with love, respect, knowing there's somebody behind that question. They might seem hostile at first, but there's a soul that's asking questions. And so be loving, be patient, be kind. Bathe your evangelism, your apologetics in prayer. Be in the Word, know the Word, so you can share it with others. This is episode 2. Episode 3 is going to come out. I'm going to have some guests on here. 3 other friends that's walked through a book that helps out kind of discipling and apologetics for Generation Z. So that's going to be coming out 2 weeks from this one. So it's going to be coming out every 2 weeks. So I hope you look forward to tuning into that. Catch it on your podcast catchers. Catch it on YouTube at Denver Baptist YouTube channel. And hope you tune in next time. God bless.